There is a particular kind of loneliness that begins in a beautiful place, and Frances knew it before she could speak. She was born into a house that sat at the edge of a royal estate, close enough to borrow the light of a palace, far enough to be forgotten by it, and that distance, that nearness without belonging, would follow her for the rest of her life. People who heard her name later would picture the grandmother of a future king, the mother of the most photographed woman in the world, a woman surrounded by titles and estates and history. They would assume that a life so close to royalty must have been a soft one. It was not. It was, in fact, a life of repeated loss, quietly born, in which the people she loved most were taken from her one by one, sometimes by death, sometimes by courtrooms, sometimes simply by walking away. And through all of it she kept a straight back and a calm face, because that was what she had been taught to do long before anyone was watching. This is the story of Frances Shand Kydd, and it is sadder than the fairy tale ever let on. She was born on the 20th of January 1936 at Park House, a large rented home that stood on the royal estate at Sandringham in Norfolk. The date matters, because on that same day, a few miles away, King George V died in his bed at Sandringham House. So the country woke to mourning on the morning Frances arrived, church bells tolling for a dead king while a baby girl drew her first breath in a house on his land. It is the sort of coincidence that means nothing and yet lingers, because her whole life would carry that same strange doubling joy and grief arriving on the same day, celebration shadowed by loss, a christening gown and a black armband in the same week. She entered the world in a house of quiet mourning, at the edge of a palace that would never quite be hers, and in a sense she never left that position. She spent her entire life near the centre of British grandeur, and never once safely inside it. Her family was old and complicated and moneyed in the particular way that the British aristocracy admired, which is to say the money had been in the family long enough to stop being embarrassing. Her father was Maurice Roche, the 4th Baron Fermoy, a friend of the man who would become King George VI. The Roche title had an interesting thread running through it, because Maurice was the son of an American heiress named Frances Ellen Work, a wealthy woman whose fortune had crossed the Atlantic and married itself into a British barony, the way American money often did in those years, buying a coat of arms with a checkbook. So Frances carried, somewhere in her blood, a little of that New World boldness, that willingness to reach for a life above one's assigned station. It would surface in her later, and it would cost her. Her mother was a more formidable presence still. Ruth Roche, Lady Fermoy, was elegant, disciplined, musically gifted, and deeply embedded in the royal circle. She was a confidant and a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, the woman who would one day be known to the nation as the Queen Mother, and that friendship gave Ruth a kind of authority that money alone could not. She understood the codes. She knew which fork, which curtsy, which silence, which smile. She had built her standing on being useful and correct to the most powerful family in the land, and she guarded that standing the way a person guards the only thing they are certain of. She was not a warm mother in the modern sense. Warmth was not the point. Correctness was the point. A daughter of Ruth Fermoy was expected to be poised, to marry well, to reflect credit upward, and above all to never ever cause a scene. You cannot understand what happened to Frances without understanding her mother, because the great wound of Frances's life would be delivered not by a stranger, not by the press, not even really by a husband, but by this exact woman, her own mother, in a courtroom, years later. That betrayal was still decades away on the morning Frances was born, but it was already, in a sense, written into the household, because the household ran on a single unbending rule. The family's standing came first. Everything else, including a daughter's happiness, came somewhere after. Frances grew up inside privilege that looked, from the outside, like everything a child could want. There were the big houses, the servants, the horses, the proximity to kings and queens. The Roche and Fermoy connection meant that the royal family was not a distant abstraction, but a set of neighbours, playmates, and expectations. And yet the childhood itself was, by the standards of feeling rather than furniture, a lonely one. Children of that world were raised at arm's length, handed to nannies, sent away to school young, and taught that emotion was a private matter to be managed rather than shared. Frances learned early to keep her feelings behind a pleasant expression. She learned that love in her family was a conditional thing, awarded for good behaviour, withdrawn for embarrassment. She learned that a girl's job was to be decorative and dutiful and quiet about her disappointments. She was educated at a boarding school in Essex, sent off as girls of her class were sent off, to be finished and polished and prepared for the only career that was truly available to her, which was marriage. Not a profession, not a passion, just marriage, a good marriage to a good name, the higher the better, and the sooner the better. This was not cruelty exactly. It was simply the water she swam in. Nobody sat her down and told her that her value lay chiefly in whom she could marry and the sons she could produce. Nobody had to. It was in the air of every room she had ever stood in, and Frances, it should be said, was well suited to shine in that world, at least on the surface. She was pretty in the way that photographs loved, with fine features and a quick intelligence, and a streak of humour that could light up a formal dinner. She was said to have entranced London when she came out into society, a vivacious young woman with lovely looks and a spark of mischief behind the good manners. She was, in the language of her set, a catch, and she was very young. It is easy, looking back from a distance, to see her as a mature figure, a mother, a grandmother, a woman of a certain age in later photographs. But at the start she was a teenage girl who had been raised to want approval more than anything, because approval was the only currency her family truly spent. That hunger for approval is the thread to hold on to. It explains almost everything that came after. Frances had been shaped from the cradle to earn love by being what powerful people wanted her to be. She had learned to read a room and become whatever that room required. And so, when the time came, she did exactly what she had been built to do. She found a grand and suitable man from an even grander family, and at 18 years old, barely more than a child, she married him. The wedding would be magnificent, the guest list would gleam, and the whole country would approve. Almost no one asked whether the girl at the centre of it was happy. That was not a question her world knew how to ask. On the 1st of June, 1954, Frances Roche married John Spencer, the Viscount Althorp, at Westminster Abbey. She was 18. He was 30, 12 years older, an age gap that in that era raised no eyebrows at all, and today reads rather differently. It was, by every outward measure, a triumph. The Abbey, the Bishop, the crowds, the society photographers, the Queen herself was among the guests, and the newspapers duly noted that royalty had come out for the occasion, because the marriage joined two families with deep threads into the royal household. For Ruth Vermoy, watching her teenage daughter marry a future earl in the most prestigious church in the country, with a monarch in the pews, this was the fulfilment of everything she had drilled into the girl. Her daughter had married up, married well, married exactly as planned. On paper it was a masterpiece. The man she married was Edward John Spencer, known to everyone as Johnny. He was the only son of the 7th Earl Spencer, heir to the earldom and to Althorp, one of the great houses of England, a vast estate in Northamptonshire stuffed with centuries of portraits and silver and history. He was handsome in a solid military way, and there was a real record behind him. He had served as an officer in the war, had landed in France the day after the invasion, had led men in the liberation of French towns. Afterward he had served as an equerry, a personal attendant to the royal family itself, first to King George VI and then to the young Queen Elizabeth. He was, in short, precisely the kind of man Frances had been raised to marry, solid and titled and moving in royal circles, correct in every particular. But a resume is not a marriage, and a man can be brave in a war and cold at a breakfast table. Behind the excellent credentials, Johnny Spencer was a conventional, sometimes rigid, sometimes moody man, formed by the same emotionally frozen upper-class world that had formed Frances, only from the other side of it. He had grown up expecting to be obeyed. He carried the weight of a great name and a great house, and the single most important duty that came with them, a duty that would settle onto Frances's shoulders the moment the wedding was over. The Spencer line needed to continue. That meant it needed a son, not simply another child, but a son, an heir to carry the earldom forward, because in that world a daughter, however beloved, could not inherit the title. She could be adored in the nursery and remain, in the eyes of the lawyers and the lineage, beside the point. So consider the position of this 18-year-old bride. She had done the great thing, she had married the heir, and on the far side of the confetti waiting for her was an assignment: produce the boy. Everything else about her, her wit, her looks, her spark, the very qualities that had made her a catch, was now secondary to a single biological task that she could not fully control, and would be blamed for regardless. She'd been raised to believe her worth was conditional, and now the condition had a name, and the name was son. The young Spencers set up their married life on the Sandringham estate at Park House, the very same house on the very same royal land where Frances herself had been born. There is something quietly haunting in that. The house that had received her into the world as a baby now received her again as a wife, and would soon receive her own children. The place never let her go. She was living, in the most literal sense, inside her own beginning, in the shadow of the palace, in the orbit of the same royal family her mother served. The circle was closing around her before she had ever really stepped outside it. The children began to come. In 1955, a little over a year into the marriage, Frances gave birth to a daughter, Sarah. 2 years after that, in 1957, a second daughter, Jane. 2 healthy girls, both loved, both bright. And yet you can hear, underneath the christenings, the sound of a family holding its breath. Because 2 daughters, in the arithmetic of an earldom, did not solve the problem. They were wonderful. They were also, in the eyes of the succession, not the answer. The pressure did not ease with each birth. It tightened. Every year without a son was another year of a question that was never asked aloud at dinner, but hung over every meal, the quiet and constant question of when there would finally be a boy. We should sit for a moment with what that pressure really was, because it is easy to say the words male, heir, and move on, and much harder to feel them. Imagine being a young woman in your early 20s, married to a man of the world 12 years your senior, living on royal land under the eye of your exacting mother and your husband's ancient family, and understanding with total clarity that your entire standing, your success or failure as a wife, as a Spencer, as a woman, would be decided by whether your next baby was a boy. Not whether the child was healthy, not whether you were happy, only whether it was a boy. That is a monstrous thing to place on a person, and it was placed on Frances not by any single villain, but by the whole architecture of the life she had been so carefully prepared for. The gilded cage was closing, and it had been built brick by people who loved her and called it her good fortune. She had done everything right. She had been the poised daughter, the beautiful debutante, the perfect bride. She had married the heir at 18 in front of the Queen. By every rule she had ever been taught, she should have been winning. And instead she was standing in a lovely house that had been hers since birth, carrying the impossible weight of a body that was expected to perform on command, waiting for a son who might come or might not, and knowing that if he did not, the fault, unfairly and totally, would be laid at her feet. Then, in 1960, the son came, and what happened to him is the true beginning of the sadness. In 1960, Frances gave birth to a boy. They named him John, after his father. The heir had arrived. After the 2 daughters, after the years of quiet pressure, the family finally had its son, and you can only imagine the relief that must have moved through that household, the sense that at last the great worry was over, the future was secure, Frances had done the thing she was meant to do. He lived for around 11 hours. The baby was gravely unwell, his lungs unable to sustain him, and within less than half a day of his birth he was gone. The son they had waited for, the answer to the unspoken question at every dinner, the boy who was supposed to make everything all right, died almost as soon as he arrived. And Frances, the young mother, went from the highest possible hope to the deepest possible grief in the space of a single day. Joy and mourning again on the same date, exactly as it had been on the day she was born. The house at the edge of the estate had given her life alongside a dead king, and now it took her son within hours of giving him to her. There is a cruelty that follows this kind of loss in a world obsessed with lineage, and Frances was not spared it. In a gentler family, in a gentler time, the death of an infant son would have been simply a tragedy, a thing to grieve together, a private sorrow. But in the world of the earldom, it was also coldly a failure of the task. The heir was still needed. The problem was still unsolved. So on top of the raw grief of losing her baby, Frances now carried the knowledge that she had to try again, that her body was still a question mark hanging over the succession, and that time was not on her side. Grief was not permitted to be the whole of it. Grief had to share the room with expectation. She became pregnant again soon afterward, reaching for the child that might heal the wound and settle the fear, and that pregnancy ended in miscarriage. She kept it a secret, told almost no one, folded the loss away inside herself the way she had been taught to fold everything away, behind the pleasant face, out of sight. 2 losses now, close together, both silent, both carried alone, a dead son and a lost pregnancy, and around her a family whose chief concern remained the boy who still had not come. Then came the investigations, and this is one of the quiet indignities of her life that rarely gets told. Because the marriage had not yet produced a surviving male heir, Frances was sent for medical examination, taken to specialists to determine what was wrong with her. Note the assumption buried in that. What was wrong with her? The possibility that the difficulty might lie anywhere other than the young wife was not, in the fashion of the time, seriously entertained. It was her body that was studied, her fertility that was questioned, her failure that was assumed. She was in her 20s, she had already buried a baby and quietly lost another, and now she was being poked and tested and treated as a faulty piece of machinery that had not delivered the required product. A biographer who later studied her life put it plainly that all through this ordeal she carried a sense of guilt, a feeling that she was somehow a failure, which of course she was not. But she felt it. They made her feel it. In 1961, on the 1st of July, Frances gave birth to another daughter. They named her Diana. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the world she lived in. When Diana was born, healthy and whole, there was disappointment. A 3rd living daughter, after a dead son, was received not purely as the miracle of a healthy child, but partly as another near miss, another girl where a boy was needed. The baby who would one day become the most famous woman on earth, whose face would sell more magazines than any human being alive, whose death would stop the world, entered life as, in part, a letdown. Because she was not a boy. It is almost unbearable when you hold the 2 facts side by side. The future Princess of Wales, adored by billions, arrived to a household that had quietly hoped for someone else. Frances loved her, of course. This is not a story of a mother who did not love her children. It is a story of a mother who loved her children inside a system that kept telling her they were not quite enough. And she kept trying, because she had no permission to stop. Finally, in 1964, she gave birth to a son who lived. They named him Charles. The heir had come at last, 4 years and 1 dead baby and 1 hidden miscarriage after the first attempt. The great task was complete. Frances had, in the end, delivered exactly what the earldom demanded of her. You might think that would have brought her peace. The son was born, the line was secure. She had passed the test that had hung over her since she was 18. But by the time Charles arrived, the marriage that was supposed to be the reward for all of it had already begun to fail, and the years of pressure and grief and silent loss had left their mark on both of them. Frances had spent a decade being measured by her ability to produce a boy. She had buried 1 child, hidden the loss of another, submitted to humiliating examinations, absorbed the message that her failures were her fault and her successes were merely her duty. And she had done it all with a straight back and a calm face because that was the only way she knew. What she had not done, in all those years, was ask herself the dangerous question whether the life she'd been so perfectly prepared for was a life she truly wanted. That question was coming, and when she finally let herself ask it, and worse, when she finally acted on the answer, the same family and the same society that had built the cage around her would turn on her with a fury that would define the rest of her days. By the middle of the 1960s, the marriage between Frances and Johnny Spencer had cooled into something unhappy, and then into something worse than unhappy. The details of what went on inside that house have been described by people who studied the marriage closely in later years, and they should be handled with care, because we are talking about private pain in a family that has known enormous public tragedy. But the accounts that exist point in the same direction. The home was not a safe or gentle place for Frances. Writers who have examined the Spencer marriage have reported that Johnny could be violent, and that Frances came to feel that she and her children would be safer away from him than with him. That is a heavy thing to say, and it is said here as it has been reported by others who knew the family, not as gossip but as the sober weight of the record. There is one memory in particular that has been passed down, and it belongs not to a biographer but to a child. Diana, years later, recalling her earliest years, described seeing her father strike her mother across the face and remembered hiding behind a door while her mother wept. Sit with that image for a moment. A small girl behind a door, watching, a mother crying. This is the home beneath the portraits and the silver. This is what the great cold house held. Whatever else can be said about Johnny Spencer, and he was, like all people, more than his worst moments, the picture that survives from inside the marriage is of a frightened woman and frightened children in a house that looked, from the road, like the very definition of a fortunate life. Think about how trapped she was. She was in her early 30s. She had 4 living children. She was married to a difficult and sometimes frightening man inside a family and a society that treated marriage as permanent and divorce as a scandal close to death. She had no career, because women of her class were not permitted one. She had a mother whose entire identity was built on royal approval and social correctness, a mother who would sooner see her daughter endure than embarrass the family. There was, in the ordinary sense, no door out of the room. Everyone she might have turned to had a stake in her staying exactly where she was. The pretty debutante who had entranced London was now a diminished figure moving quietly through beautiful rooms, keeping the peace, managing the moods, folding her own unhappiness away where it would not show. She had spent her whole life learning to do that. Now she was doing it as a survival skill. And then, in the middle of all of it, something happened that had almost never been allowed to happen in her carefully arranged life. She met someone who made her feel alive. His name was Shand Kydd. He was heir to a wallpaper fortune, a man with interests in Australia, where he ran a sheep farm, and he was, by all accounts, everything Johnny Spencer was not. He was warm and funny and unstuffy. He had a taste for adventure and a lightness about the whole apparatus of class and title that Frances had been suffocating inside since birth. Where her world was all inheritance and duty and the dead weight of ancestral expectation, Peter carried the air of a man who had chosen his own life rather than been assigned one. Frances met him in the mid-1960s, and something in her, some part that had been asleep since she was a girl, woke up. We should be honest about what this was. It was, in the language of the time and the courtrooms, an affair. Frances was a married woman, a mother of 4, and she fell in love with another man. There is no way to tell her story truthfully and pretend otherwise, and she never really pretended otherwise herself. But it is worth asking what that love really meant to her, because it was not, one suspects, chiefly about romance. It was about air. It was about a door appearing in a room that had never had one. For the first time in her life, Frances glimpsed the possibility that she did not have to spend the rest of her days managing the moods of a cold house and being measured against a lineage. There might be another way to live, one that was warmer and freer and chosen. And once a person who has been trapped since childhood sees that door, it is almost impossible for them to unsee it. Here the tragedy sharpens, because the very thing that might have saved Frances, the choice to leave an unhappy and frightening marriage for a man who loved her, was, in her world, the unforgivable sin. A man in her position who strayed would have been quietly forgiven, his affairs an open secret managed by discreet friends, his standing untouched. A woman who did the same was something else entirely. She was a bolter, an adulteress, a mother who had abandoned her children. The double standard was total and it was merciless, and Frances was about to walk straight into it with her eyes open, because the alternative, staying, had become unbearable. She made her choice in 1967, and in making it, this woman who had spent her whole life earning approval by doing exactly what was expected of her, did the one thing her world could never forgive. She wanted a life of her own. What that decision cost her is almost impossible to overstate, and it is where the sadness of her story stops being something that was done to her and becomes something far more complicated, a wound she partly chose, for reasons anyone with a heart can understand, and then paid for across the decades that followed. In 1967, Frances left. She moved out of the marital home and took a house in London, and she took her 2 youngest children with her, Diana, who was around 6, and Charles, who was around 3. The 2 older girls, Sarah and Jane, were away at boarding school by then, as children of that class were. For a brief period it looked as though Frances might somehow manage the impossible thing, might build a new and gentler life, might keep her little ones close while she and Peter found their footing. She and Johnny were separated. The children were with her in the city. There was, for a moment, a fragile version of a happy ending taking shape. That moment did not last, and the way it ended tells you how the power in her world was arranged. The children went to their father for the Christmas holidays of that year, as arranged, back to the country. And when the holidays ended, Johnny simply refused to send them back. He kept them. Frances, in London, waiting for her son and daughter to return to her, found that they would not be returning. Her husband had decided, and he had the power to make his decision stick, because in that era and in that world, the scales of a custody dispute were weighted heavily toward the father, and weighted even more heavily against a wife who had left. She had walked out on the marriage. She had taken up with another man. In the eyes of the law and society as they then stood, that made her the guilty party, the one who had broken the home, and a guilty mother had very little standing to demand anything at all. The children she had carried, born, and in one heartbreaking case buried, were now on the far side of a door she could not open. And then the machinery of public shame started up. Frances was named as the other woman in the divorce action brought by Peter Shand Kydd's own wife, dragged into the open as a marriage breaker. In her own divorce proceedings, she was described in the ugliest available terms: a marriage breaker, an adulteress, a woman who had abandoned her family for a lover. The label that would follow her for the rest of her life, and even into her obituaries, was fixed to her here: the bolter, the mother who ran. It was a cruel and lasting piece of shorthand, and it was also, in the plain facts, unfair, because she had not run from her children. She had tried desperately to keep them. She had taken them with her. It was their father who kept them from her, and the courts who backed him. But the label did not care about the facts. The label wanted a villain, and a woman who had dared to leave was the easiest villain of all. Consider what her own family did in this moment, because this is where the coldness of her upbringing came home to roost. She did not have the support of the people who should have stood beside her. She was renounced, cut off, treated as a source of embarrassment to be managed rather than a daughter and sister in pain. The Norfolk society she had grown up in, the world of the estate and the county set, turned its back on her. She had broken the code. She had caused the one thing her mother had spent a lifetime teaching her to avoid at any cost: a scene, a scandal. And for that, the warmth of home, such as it had ever been, was withdrawn. Try to hold the full shape of what was happening to her. She had left a marriage in which she had reportedly been struck and made afraid. She had done so partly for love and partly for survival. And the result was that she lost her children, lost her reputation, lost the acceptance of her family, and gained in exchange a public label as a heartless bolter and a private life shadowed by the absence of her son and daughter. The man in the marriage would keep the children, keep the house, keep the standing, and in time keep a comfortable place in the story as the wronged husband. The woman would keep almost nothing except the man she'd left for, and the certainty that she would never again be forgiven. This is the part of the story that the fairy tale about Diana's family always skips. Long before the world's most famous wedding, long before the paparazzi and the tunnels and the flowers piled against palace gates, there was this: a woman in a London house, waiting for two small children who were not allowed to come home. That absence would ripple forward for decades. It would shape Diana herself, who would speak as a grown woman of the trauma of her parents' separation, of nannies and instability, and a childhood cracked down the middle. The wound Frances suffered did not stay with Frances. It ran down into her children, and one of those children would carry it onto the biggest public stage in the world. But before any of that, there was one more blow still to come, and it was the deepest of them all, because it was delivered by the last person on earth who should have delivered it. The divorce came through in 1969, and with it came the formal battle over the children, and it is here that Frances suffered the betrayal that sits at the very centre of her sad life. Because when the custody of her children was decided, and when her husband was granted that custody, one of the voices that helped hand her children to their father, one of the voices that testified against Frances, belonged to her own mother. Ruth Fairmoy, the elegant confidant of the Queen Mother, the woman who had raised Frances to marry well and never cause a scene, went into the proceedings and gave evidence against her own daughter. She sided in the deepest crisis of Frances's life, not with the child she'd borne, but with the family name, the social order, the correct thing. She judged that Frances, the bolter, the woman who had broken the marriage, was not the parent who should keep the children. And her word carried enormous weight, because she was Ruth Fairmoy, respected, royal, unimpeachable. When a grandmother of her standing stood up and effectively declared that her own daughter was the one at fault, the outcome was close to sealed. Try for a moment to feel this from inside Frances's skin. She had already lost her infant son. She had already lost a pregnancy in secret. She had already lost the acceptance of her family and the good opinion of society. She was already losing her children to a court that saw her as the guilty one. And now, in that same proceeding, the person she might have prayed would defend her. The woman who had given her life stood up and helped take her children away. It is one of the loneliest images in this whole story. Frances, in her early 30s, alone against her own husband and her own mother, watching the two people most bound to her by blood and by vow line up on the other side and losing. The court granted custody to Johnny. In an era when mothers usually kept young children, the father won, and that reversal tells you exactly how thoroughly Frances had been cast as the one in the wrong. Her 4 surviving children would be raised primarily by their father at the family estate. Diana, at 6, felt the absence of her mother sharply and would feel it for the rest of her life. Charles was younger still, the older girls were away at school, and Frances, who had wanted so badly simply to keep her children near her, would now see them as an arrangement rather than a daily fact of her life, a visitor to their world rather than the centre of it. There is a temptation, when telling this part, to reach for a simple villain. It is tempting to make Johnny the monster, or Ruth the monster, or society itself the monster, and be done with it. But the truth is sadder and more human than that, and it is worth being honest about. Ruth Fermoy was not a cartoon of cruelty. She was a woman who had staked her entire life on royal approval and social propriety, who believed, in the marrow of her being, that a woman who left her marriage had forfeited her claim to respectability, and perhaps to her children too. She was enforcing the only code she trusted. She was, in her own mind, doing the right and responsible thing, protecting the family from a daughter she saw as reckless. That is what makes it so devastating. Frances was not undone by a villain who hated her. She was undone by a mother who loved the family name more than she was able, in that moment, to love her own child. Cold conviction can wound far more deeply than hot cruelty, because it arrives wearing the face of duty and calls itself care. And here is a thought that deepens the ache rather than easing it. Even if Ruth Fermoy came, in her later years, to feel some regret for what she had done, and to understand too late the depth of it, that would change little for the young woman standing in that courtroom in 1969, hearing her mother's voice used as a weapon against her. Some wounds are healed later, they are never unmade. Frances would carry that particular scar quietly for the rest of her life, folded away with all the others behind the calm face she had been perfecting since she was a girl in a house at the edge of a royal estate. So this is where Frances stood at the end of the 1960s. She was 33 years old, divorced, publicly branded, estranged from her family, and separated from her children by a court that had believed her husband and her own mother over her. She had lost, by any fair accounting, almost everything a person can lose short of their life, and she had one thing left, one thread of the future she had reached for when she opened that forbidden door. She had Peter. She had the man she'd given everything up for, the warm and funny wallpaper heir who had made her feel alive. And so, she did the only thing left to do. She turned her back on the whole glittering, punishing world that had raised her and broken her, and she went as far from it as she could reasonably go. She married Peter, and she left for the edge of Scotland, to a small island in the sea, to try at last to build a quiet life out of the wreckage. For a while, remarkably, it almost worked. On the 2nd of May, 1969, just after her divorce came through, Frances married Peter Shand Kydd, and then the two of them did something that would have been unthinkable to the family she had been born into. They walked away from the whole world of the aristocracy. They did not stay near the estates and the county set and the royal circle. They went in the opposite direction, north and west, to the far edge of Scotland, to a small island called Seal, reached from the mainland by a single graceful stone bridge over a narrow sound of sea. There they bought an 18th century farmhouse called Arden Capel, about 10 kilometres from the harbour town of Oban, and they set about becoming something Frances had never been permitted to be, ordinary and private and free. For a time, it was good, quietly, deeply good. This is important to say because a story of relentless sadness would not be a true story, and Frances's life was not relentless. It had a long stretch of light in the middle of it, and that stretch was here, on the island, with Peter. They lived a life that had nothing to do with earldoms. Peter ran sheep, and the couple divided their time between Scotland and a sheep farm far away in New South Wales in Australia, so that Frances, the former Viscountess, the woman who had been raised to be mistress of a great house, spent parts of her middle years on a working farm on the other side of the world. In Oban they even opened a gift shop, an utterly unpretentious little enterprise, the sort of thing that would have made her mother wince. The elegant debutante who had married the heir in Westminster Abbey now sold souvenirs in a small Scottish town, and by many accounts she was happier doing it than she had ever been in the grand cold rooms of her first life. She and Peter were a lively, popular couple on the island. People liked them. Frances had that spark, the wit and warmth that had entranced London 2 decades earlier, and away from the crushing scrutiny of her old world it could breathe again. She could be funny. She could be herself. She was not being measured against a lineage or watched for signs of impropriety. She was just a woman on an island, married to a man who made her laugh, living a life she had chosen for herself, rather than one that had been arranged for her before she was old enough to object. After everything she had lost, she had found, against considerable odds, a version of peace, but the peace had a shadow running through it, and the shadow was the shape of her children. They were not with her. They were growing up hundreds of miles south, with their father, in a world she had been cast out of. She saw them, of course. She was not erased from their lives, but she experienced her own children in visits and holidays and arranged handovers, rather than in the ordinary daily fabric of raising them. And there is a specific grief in that which every separated parent knows. You miss the small things, the breakfasts, the bedtimes, the school mornings, the 1,000 tiny, unremarkable moments that add up to truly knowing a child. Frances had those moments taken from her by a courtroom, and no amount of island contentment could fully fill the space they left. She had built a good life. She had built it around a hole. Meanwhile, the world she'd left kept moving without her, and it kept reminding her, at intervals, of everything she had walked away from. In 1975, Johnny's father died, and Johnny became the 8th Earl Spencer. The family moved from the Sandringham estate to Althorpe itself, the vast ancestral house, and Frances's children became the children of an earl living in one of the great homes of England. The following year, in 1976, Johnny remarried. His new wife was Rain, a countess, the daughter of the famous romantic novelist Barbara Cartland, a formidable and polarizing woman who swept into Althorpe and rearranged it, and was not, to put it gently, embraced by her stepchildren. The Spencer children found their new stepmother difficult, and the friction added another crack to a family that was already full of them. For Diana especially, the home of her childhood had become a place presided over by a woman she resented, in the continued absence of the mother she missed. The instability that had begun with the separation did not settle. It simply changed shape. So while Frances was selling gifts in Oban and running sheep with Peter, her children were growing up inside a grand and complicated household, loved but unsettled, shuttling between a distant island mother and a remarried earl father and a stepmother they disliked. It was nobody's idea of a happy childhood, and the person who bore the guilt of it most heavily, fairly or not, was Frances, because she was the one who had left, and leaving was the sin the world would never let her put down. Through the 1970s she made the best of it, as she always did. She tended her relationships with her children as well as distance would allow. She was, by the accounts of those years, devoted to them in the ways she could be, keeping the connections alive across the miles, and she leaned into the life she had built with Peter, the farming, the island community, the sheer relief of a world that did not judge her every move. If the story had ended here, in the late 1970s, on the island, with the gift shop and the sheep and the difficult but not unhappy middle of a life, we might almost call it a recovery. A woman who had been broken by her first life and had painstakingly built a smaller, warmer, truer one out of the pieces. But it did not end there. 2 more great blows were coming, and they would arrive from the 2 directions she was least able to defend against. One would come from the daughter she had lost and half regained, and one would come from the man she'd given up everything to be with. Between them, they would take away the 2 things Frances had managed to salvage, her privacy and her love, and leave her at the far end of her life more alone than she had ever been. The first of them arrived, strangely, disguised as the happiest news in the world. On the 24th of February 1981, it was announced that Frances's youngest daughter, Diana, was engaged to marry the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne. Overnight, the shy 19-year-old became the most famous young woman on the planet, the future queen, the face on every front page from London to Tokyo. And overnight, Frances Shand Kydd, who had spent more than a decade rebuilding a quiet, obscure private life on a Scottish island, precisely so that she would never again be at the mercy of public judgment, was dragged back into the glare she had fled. Think of the cruel irony of it. She had lost her old life partly to the machinery of publicity and shame. She had escaped to the most remote corner of the country she could find. She had made herself invisible on purpose, healed in the quiet, become nobody in the eyes of the world, and found peace precisely there, in being nobody. And now, through no choice of her own, she was somebody again. She was the mother of the Princess of Wales. The cameras that had once branded her a bolter came looking for her again, this time to photograph the mother of a princess, and there was nowhere on any island far enough to hide from that. Her privacy, the thing she had rescued from the wreckage of her first life, was gone in a single announcement. She would never fully get it back. The wedding, in July of that year, was watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. It was sold to that watching world as a fairy tale, the shy young English girl marrying her prince. And Frances sat in the cathedral as the mother of the bride, at the very heart of the most public romance of the century. And here is the sadness folded inside the spectacle, the thing the cameras never caught. That day, which the world remembers as pure joy, was for Frances and Diana a day of private strain. Diana, years later, speaking with painful honesty about her own life, said that her mother let her down over the wedding, that Frances had wept and said she could not cope with the pressure of it all. Whatever the full truth of that moment between them, and there are always two sides inside a mother and daughter, it tells us that even at the summit of the fairy tale, the old family wounds were right there in the room. The separation, the lost years, the ache of a childhood cracked in half, none of it had been healed by a wedding. It had merely been dressed in white and shown to the world. After the wedding, the closeness Frances might have hoped for did not come. Their relationship remained by many accounts a turbulent and difficult one. A mother and the daughter she had lost as a small girl, unable to fully close the distance between them. It is one of the quiet heartbreaks of Frances's life, that the reunion with Diana, the healing of that original wound from the custody battle, never truly and lastingly came. They were, by many accounts, remarkably alike, the two of them. The same looks, the same slender figure, the same charm, the same stubborn will to have things their own way. And people who are that alike often strike sparks off each other. They loved each other, in the complicated way that damaged families love, and they hurt each other, and they circled each other for years without ever landing in a stable, easy closeness. The little girl behind the door and the mother who cried had grown into two women who could not quite reach one another. And then, while the world's attention was fixed on her glamorous daughter, the second great blow of Frances's later life fell, and it fell in private, far from the cameras. Her marriage to Peter, the marriage she had sacrificed everything for, the love that had justified all her losses, began to fail. In 1988, after nearly 2 decades together, Peter left her. He left her, in the end, for a younger woman. They divorced 2 years later, and in the early 1990s he married that woman. Sit with the full weight of that, because it is one of the most painful turns in her whole story. Frances had given up her children, her family, her reputation, and her place in the world for this man. She had walked through fire for him. She had accepted the label of bolter, the loss of custody, the betrayal of her own mother, all of it, on the strength of the belief that the life she was choosing with Peter was worth the price. And now, after all those years, he was the one who walked away. The very thing she had paid so dearly to have, the great love that was supposed to redeem all the loss, was taken from her too, and taken by his choice, not hers. She'd been left before, in a sense, by her family and her society. Now she was simply, straightforwardly left, by the person she had trusted most. There was no court this time, no scandal, no headline, just a man leaving, and a woman on an island, alone. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her then, distraught. She had loved him for a long time, and she did not stop loving him easily. It is said that she hoped, for a long while, that he might come back to her, and that hope quietly died only when he married again. She blamed the destruction of the marriage, at least in part, on the very publicity that had invaded her life when Diana became a princess. It was as if, in the public eye, she had stopped being Peter's wife and become only Diana's mother, the relentless attention hollowing out her own marriage and leaving her defined entirely by her daughter's fame. Whether that was the true cause or only part of it, we cannot fully know. But you can hear in it the deep exhaustion of a woman who felt, once again, that the outside world had reached into her private life and taken something precious from her. The gift shop closed, the lively popular couple was gone, and what remained was one woman, aging now, in a small house on a remote island, with a difficult daughter she loved and could not reach, grown children living their own lives far away, a second marriage ended, and the old, familiar loneliness that had been waiting for her. It sometimes seemed, since the day she was born in a house of mourning at the edge of a royal estate, the refuge had become a solitude, and she was about to go looking, in the quietest and most unexpected place, for something that might finally hold her together. In 1994, in her late 50s, alone on her island after the end of her second marriage, Frances did something that surprised many who knew her. She became a Roman Catholic. She converted formally, deliberately, and she poured herself into the faith with the same seriousness she had once given to being the perfect debutante and the dutiful wife. And this, at last, is where the story turns towards something like grace, in both senses of the word, because the church gave Frances the one thing that a lifetime of grand houses and titles and even love had never quite given her. It gave her a way to carry her losses. She did not treat her new faith as a private comfort to be enjoyed in a quiet pew. She turned it outward, into service, and the service she chose tells you a great deal about the woman she'd become. She made pilgrimage after pilgrimage to Lourdes, the place in France where the sick and the suffering go in hope, and she went not as a grand patron but as a helper, travelling with groups of disabled people and disabled children, accompanying them, caring for them, sharing the long journeys. She made around 15 of these pilgrimages over the years, and she spoke of them not with the language of charity that condescends, but with something closer to gratitude, saying that she found it a privilege to be in the presence of those she travelled with, that they were an inspiration who helped put her own life into perspective. Think about what that means, coming from her, a woman who had lost a baby, lost her children to a courtroom, lost her mother's loyalty, lost her reputation, lost her second husband, sitting beside people in wheelchairs and calling it a privilege, calling them the inspiration. She had learned, the hard way and over a very long time, where meaning truly lives. Her care did not stop at Lourdes, on the west coast of Scotland, where the sea is dangerous and fishermen do not always come home. Frances spent her time comforting the families of the drowned and the lost. When word came that a fishing family had been bereaved, she would drive for hours across the difficult roads of the region simply to be with them in their grief. She of all people knew what it was to lose. She had buried a child. She had buried in a different way, a marriage and a family and a whole first life, and so she went to sit with strangers in the worst hours of their lives, not because it was expected of her, not because anyone was watching, but because she understood, from the inside, what those hours felt like, and she could not bear to let people face them alone when she had the strength to go. She supported the missions to deep-sea fishermen, the local fishermen's associations, a trust for disabled children, even the volunteers who trained dogs to search for the lost in the mountains and the wild, and she became a pillar of the Catholic Church in her corner of Argyll, raising a substantial sum toward the creation of a Catholic house of prayer on the sacred island of Iona. She had an unexpected tenderness too for the imperfect and the fallen within the church itself. When the local bishop of the region disgraced himself and fled after a scandal, Frances, who knew more than most about being cast out for a human failing, was notably sympathetic to him. She did not join the chorus of condemnation. She, who had been condemned, had learned not to. It would be dishonest to paint these years as pure serenity, because they were not, and Frances would not have wanted to be remembered as a plaster saint. The loneliness was real. The nights on the island were long and often entirely solitary, and she struggled, in this period, with drink. In 1996 she was convicted of drink driving and banned from the road, and though she insisted publicly that she did not have a problem, those who cared about her worried. This is not a detail to dwell on with any relish, It is simply part of the truth of a human being who had absorbed an extraordinary amount of grief across a lifetime, mostly in silence, mostly alone, and who sometimes reached for the wrong comfort in the dark, as a great many people do. It sits in the story not as a scandal, but as a measure of the weight she was carrying, and of how few hands there were to help her carry it. But the faith held her. That is the thing to hold on to about these middle-late years. For the first time in a very long time, Frances had a framework strong enough to bear the enormous accumulated weight of her losses. She had a reason to get up, a community that valued her, work that mattered, and a way of understanding suffering that did not require her to be bitter about it. She had spent her whole life being told her worth was conditional, that she had to earn her place by being decorative or dutiful or fertile or correct. The church offered her something her family never had. It offered her a place at the table that did not depend on her being anyone's idea of perfect. She could be exactly what she was, a flawed, grieving, resilient woman who had lost almost everyone and still be held. She would need every bit of that strength, because the greatest loss of her entire life, the one that would have broken most people entirely, was now only a few years away. And in a final terrible cruelty, it would come at the end of a period in which she and the daughter she was about to lose were not even speaking to one another. To understand the last silence between Frances and Diana, you have to understand what Diana's life had become by the mid-1990s. The fairy tale marriage had collapsed, slowly and then publicly and then bitterly, played out across years of front pages in a way no family should ever have to endure. In 1996, Diana and the Prince of Wales were formally divorced, and with that divorce, Diana lost the style of Her Royal Highness, a change in her title that carried for her a real sting, a sense of being cast out and diminished by the institution she had married into. Frances, watching all of this from her island, was Diana's mother, and mothers of daughters in pain do not always say the wise thing. In 1997, Frances gave an interview to a magazine, and in it she spoke about her daughter's situation in a way that Diana found deeply wounding. Frances suggested, among other things, that it was a fine thing, even a wonderful thing, that Diana had lost the royal title, and she touched publicly on her daughter's private struggles. To Frances, perhaps, this was a mother trying to reframe a humiliation as a liberation, trying to tell the world and her daughter that Diana was better off free of it all. But to Diana, exposed and raw, and weary of having her most private wounds discussed in print, it landed as a betrayal. Her own mother, speaking to a magazine about her title and her pain, it felt disloyal. It felt like being sold. The rift ran deeper than one interview. Frances, by many accounts, also disapproved of the direction Diana's life was taking, of the men her daughter was drawn to after the marriage ended, and she was not shy about that disapproval. Two strong-willed women, so alike that they struck sparks, collided one final time. And Diana, wounded and angry, did the thing that would haunt her mother forever. She cut Frances off. In the last months of Diana's life, the two of them did not speak. Frances wrote to her daughter more than once, reaching out across the silence, trying to mend it, and Diana sent the letters back unopened. She would not even read her mother's words. For roughly 4 months that was how it stood. A mother on an island writing letters, a daughter in London returning them unread. Two women who loved each other underneath everything, frozen in a standoff that neither seemed able to break, both of them presumably assuming, as people locked in a family silence always assume, that there would be time. There is always supposed to be time. The quarrel would blow over. One of them would soften. A birthday, a holiday, a small crisis would crack the ice, and they would find their way back to one another, as they had before, because that is what mothers and daughters do. There would be time. There was not time. On the 31st of August 1997, in a road tunnel in Paris, the car carrying Diana crashed. Her companion, Dodi Fayed, was killed. The driver, a man named Henri Paul, was killed. And Diana, the Princess of Wales, the most photographed woman in the world, the little girl who had once hidden behind a door and grown into a global icon, died of her injuries. She was 36 years old, and her mother had not spoken to her in 4 months. Try, if you can bear to imagine the telephone ringing on sale in the small hours of that night. Imagine Frances alone in her house by the sea, being told that her youngest daughter was dead, the daughter she'd lost as a 6-year-old to a courtroom. The daughter she had spent a lifetime trying and failing to fully reach. The daughter whose unopened letters were, perhaps, still somewhere in a London house. Her mother's handwriting on the front never read. Every parent's most unthinkable nightmare. The death of a child, arriving in the worst possible way, at the end of the worst possible silence, with everything left unsaid and now permanently unsayable. Frances had buried a son who lived 11 hours. Now she would have to bury a daughter the whole world was weeping for, and she would have to do it carrying the unbearable knowledge that their last exchange had been a returned letter. This is the single hardest fact in the whole of Frances Shand Kydd's hard life. Not the dead infant, not the lost custody, not the mother in the witness box, not the husband who left. This, a child dead, and a silence that could never now be filled. If you have ever lost someone in the middle of an argument before you could take it back, you know the particular shape of that grief, the way it has no bottom. Frances lived the rest of her life inside it. And then something happened that the whole world watched, though almost no one watching understood what they were truly seeing. Frances had to grieve her daughter in public, the most private and shattering loss a human being can suffer, the death of a child, and she had to bear it in front of billions of strangers, all of whom felt they owned a piece of Diana, all of whom were crying for a woman they had never met. The mother's grief, the real grief, the bottomless one, had to share the stage with the largest outpouring of public emotion in modern memory. She could not fall apart. She had never been allowed to fall apart. She had spent her entire life learning to keep a calm face over a breaking heart, and now that terrible skill, forged in a cold childhood and tempered by every loss since, would be called upon for the hardest performance of all. How she carried that, and what her hard-won faith did for her in the days and years that followed, is the next part of the story. It is, in its strange way, the part where the sadness and the strength finally meet. The funeral was held in early September, and it was watched by more people than almost any event in human history. A nation that had not always been kind to Diana in life poured out an ocean of grief for her in death. And at the centre of that vast public mourning sat a small family carrying a private and bottomless loss. Frances was there, the mother, bearing the child she had lost once already to a courtroom 30 years before, and was now losing forever. Her elder daughters, Sarah and Jane, Diana's sisters, gave readings, and by their mother's account they were steady and strong when it would have been so easy to break, and her son, Charles, the 9th Earl Spencer, Diana's younger brother, stood and delivered a tribute to his sister that would be remembered for years, a brother's love made into words in front of the world. And here is one of the most extraordinary things Frances ever said about that day of all days. She would later describe her daughter's funeral, strange as it must sound, as one of the proudest days of her life. Not because of the spectacle or the crowds, but because of her children. She was proud of Diana, and proud of Sarah and Jane, rock steady at the lectern, and proud of her son, who had given his sister the ultimate gift of a brother's public love. In the middle of the worst grief a mother can know, Frances found a way to look at what her surviving children had become, and to feel not only broken, but proud. That is not denial. That is not putting on a brave face for the cameras, though heaven knows she could do that too. That is a particular kind of strength, the ability to hold pride and devastation in the same heart at the same time, and it came from somewhere very deep in her, forged over a lifetime of learning to carry more than one feeling at once. Then Frances did something that almost no one in her position would have thought to do, and that tells you exactly what her hard-won faith had made of her. Diana had died in a car driven by a man named Henri Paul, who also died that night, along with Dodi Fayed. In the storm of blame and grief and conspiracy that followed the crash, Henri Paul's name was dragged through the mud, his family left to grieve a son who had become a villain in the world's telling. And Frances, the bereaved mother, the one person with the most reason of anyone to be angry, went to visit the Paul family. She sought out the family of the man at the wheel of the car in which her daughter died, and she offered them, of all things, her compassion. She had lost her child, and rather than turn that loss into rage, she turned it toward another set of grieving parents and chose to comfort them. It is one of the most quietly astonishing acts in this entire story, and it makes sense only when you understand what her faith had taught her, which was that blame is a cage, and she had spent quite enough of her life in cages. She spoke afterward about how her Catholicism carried her through the death of Diana. She said, in essence, that she had decided not to hold blame or anger over the details of her daughter's death because she could see no point in it. She reached for the belief that a child is a gift, freely given, and that a gift can be taken back without the giver owing anyone an explanation. It was, when Diana died, a wonderful thing to be a Catholic, she said, because the faith gave her a way to receive even this, the worst thing, without being destroyed by it. Whatever you believe or do not believe about the theology, you can only look at a mother finding in the wreckage of her deepest loss a framework strong enough to keep her standing and feel something like awe. She had spent decades looking for something that could hold her. She had found it just in time to survive the thing that would otherwise have finished her. And yet, underneath the faith and the compassion and the dignity, the grief was exactly as bottomless as you would expect, and now and then it showed. There is a small story from these years that says more than any grand statement could. Frances once described being in a shop when an ordinary woman, a stranger, broke down in front of her, sobbing about how much she loved and missed Diana. And Frances, the mother of that same Diana, stood there and did not cry. She said that in all the time since her daughter's death, she had allowed herself to weep in public only once. She was afraid, she said, that if she ever really started, she might never be able to stop. Hold that image. A grieving mother, comforting a weeping stranger who is crying for the mother's own dead child, and keeping her own tears locked away out of a real fear that the grief inside her had no flaw. That is what all those decades of the calm face had come to. She had become so good at not falling apart that she could stand dry-eyed in the presence of another person's tears for her own daughter, holding back an ocean, because she did not trust herself to survive letting even a little of it out. She had by now outlived 2 of her 5 children, the infant son who lived 11 hours, and Diana, the most famous woman in the world, gone at 36. No parent is meant to bury one child. Frances had buried 2, and she had years still to go. There is a detail from Diana's affairs discovered after her death that reveals how much love survived beneath the last painful silence between mother and daughter. Diana had made her will some years earlier, and in it she had expressed a specific wish. She wanted, should anything happen to her, that her former husband would consult her mother, Frances, over the upbringing, the education, and the welfare of William and Harry. Think about what that means. Even after all the friction, even after the returned letters, even in the middle of a relationship that was so often difficult, Diana had formally written her mother into the future of her sons. She had not removed Frances from her will despite the quarrels. She trusted her mother, when it came to the 2 boys, above almost anyone. It was a quiet, posthumous vote of confidence from a daughter to a mother, a way of saying, across the grave and across all the old wounds, I know who you are, and I want you near my children. Frances took that role with immense seriousness. She regarded her responsibility toward her grandsons as one of the most important things in her life, one of the last great purposes left to her, and yet, in the plain reality of it, her influence over how William and Harry were raised turned out to be small. She was far away in the north of Scotland. The boys were being brought up within the machinery of the royal family, at the centre of the very institution she had always lived at the edge of. The grandsons did not come to visit her on her island. When she wanted to see her family, it was Frances who travelled south, to see her daughters and her grandchildren and her son at the great estate at Althorpe. She was, on occasion, a guest of the boy's father at his home, staying overnight, welcomed but peripheral. Her connection to the future king was real, and it was also, in the everyday sense, thin. She loved from a distance, as she had been made to love from a distance for most of her life. She did have her small victories, her quiet influences. She was keen, for instance, that William should choose a Scottish university, and in time he did, going to St Andrews on the coast she loved, in the country that had taken her in when the rest of her world cast her out. It is a tiny thing, in the scheme of a royal life, but you can imagine what it meant to her. The idea that her grandson, the future king, would spend his university years in Scotland, on the sea, in the land where she had finally found some measure of peace, a thread, however slender, connecting the boy at the centre of everything to the grandmother out at the edge of it all, and there it is again, the shape that had defined her from the very first day. Frances Shand Kydd, grandmother of the heir to the British throne, born on royal land, daughter of a courtier, mother of a princess, and yet always, always at arm's length. close enough to the palace to be defined by it, never close enough to be sheltered inside it. She had begun her life in a house at the edge of a royal estate, and she was ending it as a grandmother at the edge of a royal family, loving the people at the centre from a small house at the far end of the country. The distance had never closed. It had only changed its clothes. By the turn of the new century, Frances was aging, and aging hard. The losses had piled up over nearly 7 decades, and her body was beginning to fail her in ways that would soon become impossible to hide. The last chapter of her life was approaching, and it would ask her to endure a few final indignities and to make one last stubborn, revealing choice about where and how she wanted to end. Even at the close, the world would not quite leave her alone, but she had one more surprise left in her, and it was the same surprise she'd been quietly delivering her whole life. She was far tougher than anyone gave her credit for. In October of 2002, Frances was called to give evidence at the trial of Paul Burrell, the man who had been Diana's butler and confidant, now accused of taking possessions belonging to the late princess. It was a case that raked over the ashes of Diana's private life in open court, and it dragged the Spencer name back into the newspapers in the most painful way, years after her daughter's death. And it required Frances, now in her mid-60s and far from well, to leave her island, travel south, and stand in the witness box at the Old Bailey, one of the most famous criminal courts in the world, to be questioned about her dead daughter. She was frail by then. She came into the courtroom leaning on a walking stick, a shadow of the vivacious young woman who had once entranced London society half a century before. And yet the old spirit was still in there. She answered what she chose to answer, and she batted away questions she found crass or intrusive, refusing to be pushed around even in that intimidating room. But the trial cost her dearly. It forced into the public record the most painful private fact of her life. Under questioning, Frances had to confirm out loud in open court that she and Diana had not spoken in the last 4 months of her daughter's life, and that Diana had returned her letters unopened. The unbearable private grief she had carried since 1997, the silence that could never be filled, was now newspaper copy, read over breakfast by strangers. Those close to her said the trial left her deeply bruised and very low, and in a final insult that reads almost like a dark joke, while Frances was away from home giving that testimony, burglars broke into her house on the island and stole her jewellery. She left her sanctuary to relive the worst chapter of her life in public, and returned to find it had been robbed. At the trial, when pressed about her visible frailty, Frances said something characteristic. She acknowledged that she had a condition she had to confront and accept, that it had taken a while to diagnose, and that she regarded it as her own private business, nothing to do with anyone else. It was later understood to be Parkinson's disease, and it was not the only thing failing her. In her final years, she was living with a long and serious illness that included both Parkinson's and cancer in the brain, the twin conditions slowly stripping away her ability to move and to speak as she once had. The woman who had driven for hours across Scotland to comfort grieving strangers now found the simple mechanics of her own body turning against her. The blows kept coming, right to the end. In the spring of 2004, a former stepson of hers, one of Peter's sons, died suddenly and far away in Southeast Asia. Another death, another loss, laid on top of all the others in the final months of her own life. And around the same time, Frances herself fell seriously ill at home and was taken to hospital in the nearby town of Auburn, one of several such trips as her health declined. Her 3 surviving children, Sarah, Jane and Charles, came to be with her, and they did what any loving children would do. They urged her to leave the island, to move somewhere less remote, somewhere closer to help, somewhere she would not be so terribly alone at the end. She refused. She would not leave Seal. She told them simply that she could not go, that the island was still where her heart was and where it always would be. And you have to understand what that refusal really was, because it was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was the last free choice of a woman who had spent the first half of her life having every choice made for her by other people. Her family had chosen her husband. The courts had chosen who would raise her children. Her mother had chosen the family name over her. Society had chosen the label that followed her everywhere. Fame had chosen to invade her privacy. Even love had, in the end, chosen to leave. For most of her life, Frances had been the object of other people's decisions, but this island, this small whitewashed house at the edge of the country, This she had chosen for herself, out of the wreckage of everything, and she was not going to be moved from it now. If she was going to die, she would die in the one place in the world that had ever truly been her own. There is something almost fierce in that. A woman who had lost nearly everything, planting her feet at the very end and saying, "This, at least, is mine, and here I stay." On the 3rd of June, 2004, Frances Shand Kydd died in Scotland after her long illness at the age of 68. She had outlived her infant son, her famous daughter, her first husband, her mother, and the marriage she had given everything to have. She died where she had chosen to die, on her island, in the country that had given her refuge, and the date of her death carried one final quiet coincidence, the kind that had bookended her whole strange life. She had been born on the day a king died, and she died, all those years later, on the anniversary of that same king's birth. Born on his ending, gone on his beginning. The house at the edge of the royal estate had opened her story with a coincidence of kings, and now it closed it with another. It was as if her life had been quietly rhyming with the crown from the first day to the last, always near it, always shaped by it, never quite held by it. Her funeral was held a week later, on the 10th of June, at St. Columba's Cathedral in the town of Oban, close to the island she had loved. And here, at last, the story offers a gentle correction to one of the cruel headlines that greeted her death. Some of the papers, reaching as papers do for the saddest possible angle, ran the story of Diana's mother dying with her family absent. A lonely end for the lonely bolter. It made for a bleak headline. It was also not the whole truth, because her family was there, her children were there, the 3 who survived her, Sarah and Jane and Charles. Her sister was there, and her grandsons were there, William and Harry, the boys their mother had wanted her to help raise, the young men in whose future she had been so carefully written. And William, the elder, the future king, stood up in that Scottish cathedral and gave a reading at his grandmother's funeral. Think of the shape of that. The grandson who would one day wear the crown, reading aloud in a small cathedral by the sea, for the grandmother who had lived her whole life at the edge of the throne. In that moment, at the very end, the distance closed. The woman who had never quite been let inside the royal circle had the future of that circle standing at her graveside, reading her home. There was one absence, and it is the one the headline seized upon. Diana's former husband, the Prince of Wales, the man who is now king, did not attend the funeral. But the reason was not coldness. He was, on that very day, travelling to Washington to represent the entire British royal family at the state funeral of a former American president, Ronald Reagan, which took place the following day. It was a duty of state, arranged long before, impossible to move. He could not be in a Scottish cathedral and in Washington at the same time. The Queen herself sent a private message of condolence to the family. The absence was real, but it was the absence of a head of state pulled to another solemn duty, not the snub the headlines implied. The family that had so often been at odds was, in the end, present. Frances was not abandoned at her grave. She was surrounded by the children and grandchildren she had loved across every kind of distance her whole life long. She was buried at Pennyfewer Cemetery, on the edge of Oban, in the region she had made her home. Not at Althorpe, the great Spencer estate where her famous daughter lies on an island in an ornamental lake, visited by tourists. Not in some grand family vault among the ancestors of the earls, but here, in Scotland, in ordinary ground, near the sea, in the place she had chosen for herself. It is exactly right, when you think about it. She had spent the first half of her life inside grandeur that never brought her happiness, and the second half building a smaller, truer life out on the edge of things. And so she was laid to rest, not in the borrowed grandeur of the Spencers, but in the plain earth of the country that had given her peace. Even her grave keeps faith with the choice she made. She belongs in the end to the island and the sea, not to the palace and the estate. A few years before her death, a biographer had written the story of her life, calling her a remarkable woman, and she was. Not remarkable in the way the world usually means, not for glamour or achievement or fame, though she brushed against all of those through her daughter. She was remarkable for something quieter and harder, for how much she lost and how she kept going. For the number of times life took the ground out from under her, and the number of times she stood back up, straightened her back, put on the calm face, and carried on. That is not the stuff of fairy tales. It is something better and rarer. It is endurance, and it deserves at the end to be seen clearly, which almost no one ever managed to do while she was alive. For most of the years after 1967, the world had a single word for Frances, and the word was bolter. It followed her into rooms before she entered them. It shaped how strangers saw her. It surfaced decades later, even in the accounts written after her death. The bolter, the woman who ran off, the mother who abandoned her children and her marriage for a lover, and got, in the eyes of many, exactly what she deserved. It is worth spending a little time, now that we have followed her whole life, taking that word apart, because it is one of the great injustices of her story, and understanding it is the key to understanding why her life was so much sadder than the label ever allowed. Consider what the word bolter really implies. It implies a woman who fled, who ran from her responsibilities, who chose her own pleasure over her children, and left them behind without a backward glance. And now hold that against what really happened. Frances did not leave her children behind. She took the two youngest with her when she left. She set up a home for them in London. She wanted them with her. It was their father who kept them over Christmas and refused to send them back, and it was the courts, backed by the testimony of her own mother, who awarded them to him and kept them from her. She did not abandon her children. She fought to keep them, and lost. The single most damning charge in the whole label, that she deserted her babies, is close to the opposite of the truth. She was not a mother who ran from her children. She was a mother who had her children taken. Then consider the double standard that the word carried, because it only ever pointed one way. In the world Frances lived in, a husband who was cold, or unfaithful, or even, as the accounts suggest, capable of violence, could remain a respected man, a pillar of the county, the wronged party in a divorce, and go on to inherit his earldom and remarry and live out his days with his reputation intact. But a wife who left an unhappy and frightening marriage was a scandal, an adulteress, a bolter, cast out of society and stripped of her children and her good name. Same institution, same failure of a marriage, two utterly different verdicts, handed down entirely according to which spouse was the woman. Frances did not invent the affair that ended her marriage, and she never pretended she had behaved perfectly. But the punishment she received was wildly out of proportion to anything she had done, and it was out of proportion precisely because she was a woman who had dared to want a different life. Her real crime, in the eyes of her world, was not adultery. It was refusal. She refused to stay quietly unhappy. And for a woman of her time and class, that refusal was the one thing that could never be forgiven. And here is the deepest injustice of the label. It flattened her. A person who studied her closely once observed that Frances was many things at once, and could not be reduced to any single one of them. She was an aristocrat by birth, and, by choice, something close to an ordinary islander. She could be, at different moments, both a manipulator of the media and a victim of it. She was a devout Catholic and the grandmother of the man who will one day be Supreme Governor of the Church of England. She contained contradictions, as complicated people do. She was witty, and she was sad. She was strong-willed, and she was wounded. She was capable of great tenderness toward grieving strangers, and capable, like her daughter, of striking sparks off the people closest to her. She was, in short, a whole human being, and the word bolter erased all of that, sanded her down to a single cautionary syllable, so that a real and complicated woman could be filed away as a simple moral lesson. The label was not just unkind, it was lazy, and it let people not see her. Because when you truly look at her, when you refuse the easy word and follow the whole life, what you find is not a scandalous woman who got her comeuppance. What you find is one of the most quietly resilient people you could hope to meet. Think of everything that was taken from her. Her infant son gone in 11 hours, a second pregnancy lost in secret. Her marriage, unhappy and frightening. Her children, awarded to their father. Her reputation destroyed. Her own mother's loyalty, given to the family name instead of to her. Her second husband, the great love she sacrificed everything for, who left her for someone younger. Her privacy, invaded the moment her daughter became famous. Her daughter killed at 36 after a silence that could never be mended. Her health, stolen at the end by two cruel diseases at once. Any one of these could break a person. Frances absorbed all of them, across nearly 70 years, and she kept finding reasons to go on. She found them in a Scottish island, in a small gift shop, in the families of drowned fishermen, in a group of disabled pilgrims, in a faith that let her carry the unbearable, in the future of two grandsons she loved from a distance. She lost, and she lost, and she lost, and she kept building small rooms of meaning out of the rubble. That is not the story of a bolter. That is the story of a survivor. There is one more thread to pull before we let the story rest, and it is the saddest and strangest of them all. Because when you set the life of Frances beside the life of the daughter she lost, you begin to see that they were not simply mother and child. They were echoes of one another. The same story, told twice, a generation apart, with the same wounds in almost the same places. Diana's tragedy, the one the whole world watched, was in many ways her mother's tragedy happening again, and almost no one at the time noticed that they had seen it before. Look at the shape of it. Frances was raised in an emotionally frozen aristocratic household, taught that love was conditional and feelings were to be hidden, sent away to school young, shaped from the cradle to marry well and reflect credit upward. And so was Diana. Diana grew up in the very same world, in fact in the very same corner of it, in that house on the Sandringham estate, in the aftermath of her parents' broken marriage, raised by nannies and a distant father, aching for a mother who had been taken away by a courtroom. The instability that cracked Frances's childhood ran straight down into Diana's, only worse, because Diana's crack was the direct result of what had been done to Frances. The lost mother of one generation became the wound of the next. Frances did not choose to pass that pain on. It was passed on anyway, through her, by the same cold machinery that had shaped her. That is how these things work in families. The hurt does not stay where it started, it travels. Then look at the marriages. Frances married at 18, a girl barely grown, to a man 12 years older from one of the grandest families in England, in a spectacular church wedding that the whole country approved of, and behind the splendour she found coldness, pressure, and unhappiness. Diana married at 20, a girl barely grown, to a man 12 years older from the very grandest family in England, in the most spectacular church wedding the world had ever seen, and behind that splendour she found coldness, pressure, and unhappiness. The parallel is almost too exact to believe. Both of them were young women handed to older, royal or near-royal men, sold to the public as fairy tales, and left to discover in private that the fairy tale was a bargain, and the bargain did not include their happiness. Both of them were expected, first and foremost, to produce a male heir, their bodies pressed into the service of a lineage. Frances struggled at that terrible task and was made to feel a failure. Diana managed it quickly, giving the crown 2 sons, and it did not save her marriage either. The difference in outcome only underlines the sameness of the trap. The women were interchangeable, only the men and the houses mattered. Then look at what the press did to each of them. Frances in the 1960s was branded a bolter, an adulteress, a scandal, her private pain turned into public copy, her reputation destroyed by newspapers that wanted a villain. Diana, in the 1990s, was hunted by the press with an intensity that had no precedent, her every meal and mood and heartbreak sold to the world, pursued by cameras into the last tunnel of her life. Both mother and daughter were consumed by the machinery of publicity. Both were reduced by it to a story that suited other people. Both learned that the same public that adored them could turn, and that there was no privacy anywhere once the world had decided it owned you. Frances even came to believe that the press attention around Diana had helped destroy her own second marriage, so that the fame that swallowed the daughter reached back a generation and took something from the mother too. They were caught, both of them, in the same net. And then, the loneliness. This is the deepest echo of all. Frances, for all her proximity to the crown, spent much of her life profoundly alone, on an island, in a small house. Her days often passed entirely in her own company. And Diana, in her final years, for all the adoration of millions, was also profoundly alone, describing herself as isolated inside her own famous life. One writer noticed it at the time, that the mother out on her Scottish island and the daughter in her London palace were living, in their separate ways, the same solitude. Both women were loved by enormous numbers of strangers and truly known by almost no one. Both were surrounded and unheld. It is the specific loneliness of women who are turned into symbols, adored as an image and abandoned as a person, and the mother and the daughter suffered it in turn, a generation apart, without ever quite being able to reach across the distance and comfort one another. which brings us to the cruelest echo of all. They died estranged. In the last months of Diana's life, the two of them were not speaking, letters returned unopened, a silence neither could break. And so the final chapter of their story is a mother and a daughter, so alike that they could not stop hurting each other, so wounded by the same cold world that they could not find their way home to one another, separated at the end by a quarrel that death made permanent. Frances lived 7 more years after Diana died, and she lived every one of them inside that unfinished silence. The mirror had one last thing to show her. She had lost her own mother's loyalty in a courtroom in 1969, and she lost her own daughter's voice to a returned letter in 1997. 3 generations of Spencer and Fermoy women, and at the joins between them, again and again, the same thing, a rupture, a silence, a love that could not quite get through. That is the final layer of why her life was so much sadder than anyone thought. Not only because of what she suffered, though she suffered enormously, but because her suffering was not even unique to her. It was a pattern, running through the women of her family, handed down like the good looks and the slender figure and the stubborn will, from a cold mother to a lonely daughter, to a hunted granddaughter, each of them close to the throne, and none of them sheltered by it. Frances stood in the middle of that chain, receiving the wound from the generation above her, and, without ever meaning to, passing a version of it to the generation below. She spent her whole life trying to be good enough to be loved, and she raised, in her absence, a daughter who spent her whole life doing exactly the same, and the world called them both fortunate, and neither of them was. We began at a house on the edge of a royal estate, on a January morning in 1936, with a baby drawing her first breath while church bells tolled for a dead king a few miles away. Joy and grief on the same day, grandeur close enough to touch and never quite close enough to hold. That, we said, was the shape of her whole life, and now that we have walked the length of it, you can see how completely true that turned out to be. She spent her entire life near the centre of things and never safely inside it. Born on royal land, daughter of a courtier who served a queen, married at 18 to a future earl, in an abbey, with a monarch in the pews. Mother of a princess whose face the whole world knew. Grandmother of the boy who will be king. By any list of connections, Frances Shand Kydd lived at the very heart of British royalty for nearly 70 years. And yet the truth of her life was distance. She was never protected by the grandeur that surrounded her. It gave her expectations and pressure and a label and a great deal of loss, and it withheld the one thing she seemed to need most, which was simply to be held, to be chosen, to be allowed to be herself without having to earn it. The world looked at her and saw good fortune. It saw the titles and the estates and the proximity to crowns, and it assumed that a life so close to royalty must have been a soft and lucky one. That was always the mistake. The grandeur was the wrapping, not the gift. Underneath it was a woman who lost her son, her children, her reputation, her mother's loyalty, her great love, and finally her famous daughter, and who bore almost all of it in silence, behind the calm face she had been taught to wear before she could even understand why. Her life was not a fairy tale with a sad ending. It was a hard life, made harder by a world that punished her for wanting more than it was willing to give her, and then decided she had brought it all on herself. And yet the last word should not be sorrow, because Frances herself did not let sorrow have the last word. At the end, she was not in a palace or a great house. She was in a small whitewashed home on a windswept island at the far edge of the country, a place she had chosen, the only place that was ever truly hers. She had her faith, which let her carry what she had to carry. She had her memories and her regrets, and she had, quietly, her peace. When her children begged her to leave that island for somewhere safer at the end, she told them she could not, because it was where her heart was and always would be. She'd spent the first half of her life having every choice made for her. She spent the last of it planting her feet on her own ground and refusing to be moved. There is a kind of victory in that, small and hard won, and easy to miss, but real. She was born on the day a king died, and she died on the day that king was born, as though her whole life had been quietly turning in time with a crown she was never allowed to wear. In between those two dates lay a story the world thought it knew and never really did. Not the mother of a princess, not the bolter, not a lucky woman who lived near palaces, just Frances, a girl raised to be perfect, who was never quite loved for herself, a woman who lost almost everyone and kept getting up, a survivor who found, at the very end on a small island by the sea, something that all the grandeur of her early life had never once given her, a place to rest. And rest, in the end, was all she had ever really wanted.